What are your thoughts on this current movement at the moment, which is people avoiding and sometimes demonizing meat consumption because of activating the mTOR pathway?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a confusion between chronic activation of the mTOR pathway and acute activation. So we do need mTOR to be active sometimes, right? I mean, mTOR is the most important amino acid sensor we have in our body. And if we want to be in an anabolic state at some times, which we do, it's going to have to be activated, right? In fact, I would argue that the three most important amino acids, leucine, lysine, methionine, mTOR is the leucine sensor, right? I mean, leucine and mTOR were sort of made for each other. This is very different from the metabolically ill person whose mTOR level is probably chronically elevated. There's also an issue with tissue specificity. And again, part of the challenge here is in humans, we have no way of measuring this. So we can measure this stuff in mice. You can sort of look at mTOR activation in muscle versus liver versus some other tissue. In humans, we can't do any of this. We don't have what David Sabatini refers to as an mTOR integrator, a signal integrator. So the way that hemoglobin A1C is an integrating function of average glucose, right? It integrates glucose level over the previous 3 months roughly. We don't have a tool like that to measure mTOR activity. So again, I think that the belief that we need to limit amino acids to limit mTOR activity is kind of a backwards way to think about it. What that's really going to do is create a situation of sarcopenia, which is muscle, like loss of muscle as we age.
Okay.
Yeah.
Surely, though, if people are consuming 3 to 4 servings of 25 to 50 grams of protein per day, is that not just going to continue to just spike mTOR? Does that not end up netting out at mTOR just being elevated throughout the day?
Not necessarily. I mean, you have to remember the duration that free amino acids stay in your circulation is pretty low. You're also probably still spending 12 to at least 14 hours a day when you're not eating. Right. So even so I'm someone who probably takes a lot of effort to consume, 1.8 to 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. And that's going to be spread out over 3 to 4 meals. But there's probably still 14 hours a day when I'm not eating anything. And during that period of time, those amino acid levels are going to be really low.
I heard about you doing some very extreme fasts over the last few years. Talk to me about those.
Yeah, I don't do that anymore, but I used to do a lot of fasting for many years. I would, do a 7 to 10 day fast quarterly and a 3-day fast monthly.
That's intense. That seems intense
to
me. I'm someone that's done intermittent fasting. I sat down with David Sinclair 4.5 years ago, I think, in his office at Harvard. And, when David first came onto the scene, which was the first time I'd really, really heard intermittent fasting as being pushed as a longevity lever, I thought, well, this is great. It's something that I can do. It's for the lazy among us. It actually makes eating food easier because we've managed to reword skipping breakfast as doing intermittent fasting. But I found it incredibly difficult to blend staying fit, staying muscular, and doing intermittent fasting. I really, really struggled to make that work. First off, why have you changed your approach to intermittent fasting? I know that you've gained a ton of muscle recently. And how have you worked in blending your understanding of intermittent fasting and its positive benefits with the fact that you want to look good, feel good, perform well?
Yeah, so I still think going back to kind of what are the 3 ways that you can reduce caloric intake. You can calorie restrict directly, so just track and reduce globally. You can dietary restrict, which is pick certain elements within the diet, carbs, fat, whatever, restrict. Or you can time restrict, create a smaller and smaller window in which to eat. The biggest drawback of that final strategy, which again is a viable strategy, but the biggest drawback of it, in my opinion, is the reduction in protein intake. So this has been borne out in the literature. So we've seen clinical trials that have documented this, that first and foremost, the time-restricted feeding within that 24-hour period doesn't seem to produce any benefits above the caloric restriction that it brings. That's a very important caveat.
Okay, it's just
Meaning there is nothing magical about the time restriction beyond the calories that are being restricted.
wow. Okay, so the hunger signal that people get, which is those of us that have taken like the Sinclair red pill, this is a signal that I'm hungry. This is hormesis happening. This is discomfort. This is good for me. Has no different impact than small amounts of satiation throughout the day with.
There's nothing that has been measured or documented in any clinical trial that suggests that that is beneficial over the caloric restriction. In other words, if you're going to eat 2,000 calories spread out over 12 hours, or you're going to eat 2,000 calories spread out over 6 hours, where you're, you're time restricted feeding for 18 hours, we're not seeing any difference.
Wow.
Now that's not, here's what's interesting. That's often not what happens. So what more likely happens is the person who calorie restricts has an easier time, believe it or not, maintaining muscle mass than the person who time restricts.
Why?
Probably for two reasons, although this hasn't been fully teased out in the data because they're not tracking it this closely. But my impression is that when you time restrict, you're just less likely to eat as much protein. And secondly, as you kind of alluded to earlier, it's a delicate balance to get the right amount of amino acids into the muscles. You can't have too much and you can't have too little. So what you don't want to do is waste, for lack of a better word, your amino acids down a gluconeogenic pathway where they're basically being used as glucose substrate.
What would cause that to happen?
Either too much or too little. So
and what's too much and what's too little?
Yeah, sort of 10 to 20 grams of protein. The liver is going to preferentially take that and use it as glucose. And anything over about 50 grams, the liver is going to say, I'm going to take that excess and also make it glucose. So let's just say your number is 180 grams of protein per day. Eating 18 servings of 10 grams a day, not going to achieve optimal results. Having one serving of 180, also not going to.
I've tried both.
Yeah. So that person really probably ought to be doing 4 servings of 45.
Right. So you're saying for most people, it seems like roughly a sweet spot is 25 to 50 grams per serving.
Exactly.
Right. So in this regard,
and that time restricted feeding guy has a really hard time doing that if he's going to be deliberate about that.
How big is the gap? When does a feeding window stop?
That's a great question. Probably about 3 or 4 hours.
So it's basically impossible.
For the time-restricted feeding person,
yes.
Unless they're willing to eat protein outside of their window.
Right, okay, which if you are dogmatic around...
If you're dogmatic, it becomes very difficult.
Correct.
But if you understand that and what we do with our patients who want to do time-restricted feeding, because I think it's the easiest one to do.
Yep.
I
would agree.
It's the easiest one conceptually to do. It's the easiest one to be compliant with. So what we would say is, look, it's just about the calories. So I still want you to have a low-calorie protein shake in the morning where you're going to have 200 calories of a protein shake. That's basically just protein, some cashew milk, and a few frozen berries. But at least you got that protein dose in.
Yep.
The other thing that I would say leads to what we experience clinically as a lot of people losing muscle mass when they do this is a lot of people exercise in the morning, but their feeding window is in the evening. So now they're creating a little bit of a gap, especially if they're untrained. It's less of an issue in a trained individual, but in an untrained individual, we do see some benefits to having the amino acids restored in greater proximity to the training.
Every single morning for over 3 years now, I've started my day the exact same way, which is with Element in water. Element contains a science-backed electrolyte ratio of sodium, potassium, and magnesium, and it is the best hydration drink that I've ever found. It tastes fantastic, it's super refreshing. Orange is just the most OP flavor in the world. It's absolutely phenomenal, and it helps to play a critical role in reducing muscle cramps and fatigue. It regulates your appetite, it optimizes brain health, and it helps curb cravings. They're also the exclusive hydration partner to Team USA weightlifting and relied on by tons of Olympic athletes and everyday high performers all around the world. Also, there is a no BS, no questions asked refund policy where you can buy a box completely risk-free, and if you do not like it for any reason, they will give you a refund during an unlimited duration, and you don't even need to return the box. That's how confident they are that you'll love it. Element are giving away a free sample pack of all 8 flavors with your first box if you go to the link in the description box below, or drinklmnt.com/MW. That's drinklmnt.com/MW. What's happening, people? If you enjoyed that, then press here for the full unedited episode. And don't forget to subscribe.